Back in March 2017, I took a weekend trip with my girlfriend to a cheap Airbnb cabin outside Elkins, West Virginia, tucked off an old logging road near Randolph County Route 33-8. I had booked it because the listing emphasized quiet woods, a simple place to disconnect, and the sort of isolation that sounded refreshing at the time. It mentioned occasional animal noises and limited cell service, which felt more like part of the charm than serious warnings. We had both been working long hours that winter and wanted to get out of town for a couple of days. The photos showed a single-story wooden cabin with a small porch and a view of endless trees. It looked harmless, almost generic, the kind of place people passed around as a secret getaway. The first night passed exactly as the listing implied. We arrived before sunset and settled in while there was still some light outside. The cabin was older than the pictures suggested, with thin walls, uneven floorboards, and a faint smell of cold wood that had soaked up years of damp mountain air. The place had a small kitchen, a narrow front room with mismatched furniture, and a bedroom just large enough for the bed and a dresser. Out the windows, the tree line pressed in close, so close that even during daylight the interior felt shaded. Once it got dark, the woods became a single black shape rising around the structure. The lack of cell service turned out to be real. We tried to send a quick message to family that we had arrived, but the signal fell to one bar, then none. I figured we could drive down to town if we needed to check in with anyone, and we let it go. We made a simple dinner, played cards by a lantern we had brought, and listened to the normal noises of a place that settled as the temperature dropped. The old logging road had been quiet when we drove in, and it stayed quiet the entire night. Not a single car passed. The quiet was actually pleasant. When I fell asleep, it felt like the cabin was suspended in its own world. The second day was calm as well. We spent most of the morning hiking a short, unmarked path behind the cabin that led to a ridge overlooking a valley. There were still patches of snow in shaded spots, and the air kept shifting between warm sun and cold wind. By late afternoon we returned to the cabin and made an early dinner. The isolation no longer felt charming in the same way it had the first night, but it still felt manageable, still within the boundaries of normal. The woods were just woods, the silence just silence. Everything changed on the second night. It was sometime around 2:15 a.m. when I woke up. At first I thought the heater had kicked on, because the sound that woke me was deep and physical, like a vibration inside the wall. Then my brain caught up, and I realized the heater wasn't running at all. The sound had been a thump. Not on the door, not somewhere distant outside, but directly on the wall beside the bed, close enough that it felt like someone had hit the wood with the flat of a hand or struck it with something heavy. My heart immediately picked up. I stayed still, waiting to hear it again, telling myself it could have been settling wood or a shifting branch. The woods were dense, and fallen limbs could easily lean against the exterior. I tried to think of every normal explanation, but none fit the physical jolt I had felt through the mattress. The wall had actually moved. Another thump followed. This one was higher, maybe 3 feet above the first one. It had the same dull, deliberate force. The sensation of something climbing rose through me before I consciously thought it. The wall next to the bed had no windows, no deck, nothing a person could stand on. Outside that wall was bare ground sloping slightly downward, making the exterior even harder to reach. The only thing at that height outside was empty air and tree trunks several feet back. I reached for my phone because it was the only light source we had. The cabin had no outside lights at all. My girlfriend had already tensed awake beside me, but neither of us moved at first. The phone cast a weak glow, just enough to give shape to the small room, but not enough to make me feel braver. After a long stretch of silence, I slid out of bed and stepped into the front room. The floorboards creaked in slow, exaggerated protests that sounded too loud in the stillness. I went to the window overlooking the porch. The curtains were thin, more decorative than useful, but they still blocked most of the outside. When I parted them with 2 fingers, the phone's reflection filled the glass, and beyond it was only blackness. My eyes struggled to adjust. The woods blended into a single indistinct wall. For several seconds there was nothing unusual, nothing to justify how tense my shoulders had become. Then my focus shifted to something close, something on the porch itself. The rocking chair. When we had arrived, it had been placed neatly by the door, angled inward. But now it faced outward, toward the trees. I could see only the faintest outline of it in the ambient light, yet the change in its orientation was unmistakable. I stared at it for what felt like minutes, until it moved. Not much, not fast. Just one slow, heavy rock forward and back, the sort of motion that should have required a push of air, though the night outside looked completely still. Behind me, the old wood of the cabin gave a faint, strained creak. I turned away from the window and walked back toward the bedroom. My girlfriend was standing near the dresser, her attention fixed on the side window that sat unusually high on the wall. That window had always looked out of place, positioned nearly 8 feet above the ground outside, because the land sloped sharply downward on that side of the cabin. It was the reason neither of us had thought to close the blinds. Nobody could reach it without a ladder or a truck bed or something tall enough to stand on. The glass was completely dark except for one pale shape pressed against it. It was so small that at first my mind tried to turn it into something harmless, like a patch of frost or some reflection from inside the room. But it wasn't frost, and it wasn't a reflection. It was an ear, flattened against the glass as if someone outside was leaning in with their head turned sideways, listening through the window. For a long moment nothing happened. The ear remained still. The glass didn't fog. The shape didn't shift. I couldn't see any other part of a face, just that pale curve and the edge of skin lit by the faintest trace of ambient night. My throat tightened in a way I had never felt before. I backed away, slow and quiet, fighting the instinct to run. My thoughts scrambled for any possible explanation. A hunter passing through the woods. A hiker who got lost. Someone who needed help. But every explanation collapsed under the questions that followed. No one should have been wandering that deep in the woods at that hour. No one would reach that window without planning to, and no stranger would press an ear to the glass instead of knocking on the door. I decided to leave. Not in the morning, not after thinking it over, but immediately. The only keys were in the kitchen, and my boots were by the front door. Moving through that cabin felt like walking through a basement you suddenly realized wasn't empty, trying not to make noise but also desperate to be fast. I grabbed the keys. My girlfriend stayed behind me, clutching her bag with shaking hands. The entire cabin felt poised around us, silent but alert, like everything outside was waiting to hear what we did next. I opened the front door as quietly as I could. The air outside was colder than I expected and carried the thick smell of wet leaves. The rocking chair sat still now, facing the woods, as rigid as any piece of dead furniture. Nothing moved in the trailing. Nothing made a sound. We stepped off the porch and walked toward the car, first cautiously, then faster, and then at a pace that was just short of running. Every second that passed felt stolen. I unlocked the car, we got in, and I turned the engine over. The headlights cut through the trees, long and shaking with the vibration of the motor. Nothing appeared in the beams, but I felt the certainty that someone had been there moments earlier. We drove back toward the main road, over the potholes and gravel and uneven ruts of that old logging path. I checked the rearview mirror far more often than necessary, expecting to see someone following or standing in the headlights' reach. But the road stayed empty. The woods stayed dark. When we finally reached a stretch with enough service to make a call, I reported what we had seen. The county sheriff's office sent someone to check on the cabin a couple of hours later. The deputy who called me back said there were fresh boot prints in the soft ground by the side of the cabin, directly under the high window. The prints faced the wall, toes pointed in. They were deeper than simple standing prints, like whoever made them had been pushing upward or bracing themselves to lean against the glass. He didn't ask many questions after that. He only said the cabin was secured for the time being, and that the property owner would be notified. There was nothing else to add. We never returned. We didn't request a refund, and we didn't leave a review. For months afterward, I kept thinking about that quiet patch of West Virginia woods, that old cabin sitting alone with no porch light, no neighbors, and walls so thin you could feel someone knocking from outside. I thought about the ear pressed against the glass 8 feet above the ground, and the way the rocking chair had faced the woods, as if someone had been sitting there long before we woke up, watching the cabin and waiting for the right moment to come closer. I parked on the narrow shoulder along State Route 610 just after 3 in the afternoon. The sun still high but softened by a thin milky haze that made the mountains look farther away than they really were. The old man in town had pointed me toward a rutted lane I never would have noticed otherwise, a break in the brush with 2 tire tracks swallowed by weeds. I was out there for the Historical Society, trying to map cemetery plots that hadn't been recorded in decades, if ever. Most sites were on private land or tucked into forgotten hollows. This one, he'd said, was small and old and easy to miss until the trees start leaning in. He'd raised a hand in a vague direction, and left it at that. I turned off the engine and listened to the ticking metal settle. The place felt cut off from everything. No houses nearby, no passing cars, just the layered smell of warm leaves and damp clay. The dirt road was too rough for the Jeep past the first bend, so I grabbed my day pack, locked up, and started hiking the last half mile. The road climbed gently, just enough to keep my breath steady but noticeable, winding between shoulder-high laurel and the trunks of tulip poplars that arched over the track. Their upper branches knitted together, making the whole path feel like a long hallway. The deeper I went, the more the air cooled, and I could hear nothing but the occasional rattle of a cicada or the thump of a walnut dropping somewhere off in the brush. By the time I reached the clearing, the sunlight had thinned into a paler version of itself, like it had trouble reaching the ground. The cemetery was exactly what I'd expected. Isolated, unkempt, maybe 12 or 13 gravestones scattered in no particular order. They leaned at odd angles, some half swallowed by moss, others buried so deep that only their rounded tops showed. Every one of them looked worn down to the point of unreadability. Except one. Near the back, almost against the tree line, stood a white marble marker that didn't match anything else there. It was bright, clean, and surprisingly new compared to the others. The name carved on it stopped me. Jeremy Cox, 1994 to 2013. Whoever he was, someone had cared enough to place fresh plastic flowers there, still glossy, still unfaded, and a small stuffed bear slumped beside them, its fur matted and darkened from rain. It didn't fit the place at all. This burial was younger than me, younger than many of the college kids who passed through Wise County every fall. Yet the grave looked like it had been tended recently, maybe even within the week. I walked the perimeter first, taking my usual wide loop to get bearings. The ground had a gentle dip toward the center, probably from years of runoff. The grass was long enough to brush my knees. I counted the stones in the main cluster, 12. Then I added Jeremy's as the 13th. That matched what I'd noticed on first glance, and it matched the sketchy notes the Historical Society had on file. So far, nothing strange. I took out my phone, logged the GPS coordinates, and snapped several photos from different angles, making sure to get the layout of the stones and the clearing around them. I wrote the number of graves in my notebook and sketched a basic diagram. While I worked, the light shifted in small ways, the breeze picking up, the shadows stretching a little, but that was normal this deep in the woods. I knelt near one of the older stones and brushed moss away to see if anything remained of its inscription. Nothing. The stone was too far gone, worn to a vague dome shape. When I stood again, something nudged at the back of my mind, a small feeling that I had missed a detail. It wasn't visual at first. It was more like the instinct you get in a grocery store when you've forgotten an item on your list. I looked around slowly, scanning each stone again. 14. I counted twice, then a third time. 14 stones, not 13. One more than before. I stood still long enough to hear my own pulse in my ears. I tried to tell myself I'd miscounted earlier. The stones were jumbled and uneven. It was easy to overlook one tucked behind another. That had to be it, but the layout felt wrong. Something had shifted in the pattern I'd already locked into my brain. One of the older stones, blank, rounded, nearly identical to the one I'd knelt beside, was sitting just a foot or so from my backpack. I was certain it hadn't been there when I walked in. It leaned slightly toward the center of the clearing, faintly tilting like it had been in the ground a long time, but the grass around its base was pressed in a way I hadn't noticed before. A faint ring of disturbed earth circled it. The temperature around me cooled in a way that didn't match the weather. The air had been warm the whole hike in, but now a thin chill settled across my arms, not sharp enough to be alarming, but sudden enough to feel out of place. The sky above the clearing was still bright, unbroken blue. No clouds. Nothing that should have shifted the temperature that fast. I crouched and picked at my backpack. The zipper was open halfway, though I was certain I had closed it after grabbing my notebook earlier. The teeth were pulled apart neatly, not snagged, not torn. Inside, my notebook lay open, flipped to a blank page. I hadn't left it like that. In the center of the clean page, written in pencil, was a date. September 18th, 2021, last here. The handwriting looked like mine, but uneven, as if written quickly or with a shaking hand. It took several seconds for the meaning to register fully. Today was September 18th. I felt my mouth go dry, a tight pressure building across my chest. I scanned the tree line, expecting maybe to see someone who had followed me up the road or slipped in while I was focused on the stones. But nothing moved. The woods were still. Not silent, just normal. birds calling in short bursts, the distant crack of something dropping from a tree. No footsteps, no voices, no sign of anyone else. I checked my pack for anything missing. Everything was still there: camera, map, compass, water bottle. Nothing misplaced except the open notebook and the date on the page. I tried to think through logical explanations. Maybe I'd written the date absent-mindedly, though that didn't explain the strange phrasing. Maybe the wind had flipped the notebook open, even though the pack had been zipped. Maybe the stone by the pack had always been there, just easier to overlook from certain angles. But the more I tried to force those explanations, the more they felt like thin fabric stretched over something I didn't want to examine closely. I took more photos, slowly and carefully, making sure to document the layout again. 14 stones, including the one by my pack. I walked around the perimeter, circled twice, looked for footprints in the dirt or bent grass, or any sign that someone had moved through. I found nothing. The ground inside the clearing was soft from earlier rain, but no footprints except mine. The only thing that made sense, truly made sense, was that someone from town had been here recently. Maybe they were protective of Jeremy Cox's grave. Maybe they didn't like outsiders cataloging the site. Maybe the date in my notebook was meant as a warning or a joke, something they thought would unsettle me. It had worked. I stayed another 15 minutes, making sure the documentation was complete. The sunlight grew harsher as the afternoon settled deeper, sharpening the outlines of the stones and throwing long, thin shadows between them. The place didn't feel cold anymore, just quiet in a way that made sense for a forgotten cemetery up a dirt road no one used. When I finally hiked back down to the Jeep, the chill I'd felt earlier faded completely. I kept replaying the moment I'd counted the stones the second time, trying to remember if I had truly seen only 12 before. Human memory was unreliable in settings like this. I could have misread the scene without realizing it. As for the date in the notebook, the handwriting wasn't a perfect match. The more I studied it, the more I convinced myself the strokes were subtly different, sharper angles, a tighter loop on the 9. Someone else could have written it. I drove back toward town with the windows down, letting the warm wind flood the Jeep and erase the last remnants of that cold patch in the clearing. By the time I reached the Historical Society building, the experience had settled into something explainable, or at least containable. I logged the cemetery with 14 plots. I labeled the extra stone as uninscribed and unverified. I placed the photograph of Jeremy Cox's grave in the file for more recent burials. When I looked at the notebook later that night, the date still sat in the center of the blank page, neat and deliberate. I left it there. It didn't matter who had written it. What mattered was simple and grounded in reality. Someone else had been at that cemetery before me, recently enough to leave fresh flowers, recently enough to step close to my pack without leaving a trace I could follow. Whoever they were, they had their own reasons for being there, and those reasons had nothing to do with anything supernatural or strange. The cemetery was just a quiet patch of land with more history than visitors, and the stone by my backpack had likely been there all along, half buried in the grass until I changed my angle and finally saw it. I told myself that, and it felt true enough to settle the last of my unease. On October 31st, 2020, I let myself get talked into something I should have known better than to agree to. My cousin had been hyping up this Halloween ghost hike at Seneca Rocks for weeks, and I kept brushing it off. But that afternoon he called saying he and a few of his friends were already heading out, and there was plenty of room in the truck. I didn't have any plans, and the idea of sitting at home scrolling through the same feeds all night felt worse than climbing a mountain in the dark. I threw on a jacket, grabbed a half-charged headlamp, and by the time we reached West Virginia the sun had already dropped behind the ridgeline. The parking lot near the trailhead looked emptier than I expected for Halloween night. The park usually stayed popular well past summer, especially with people doing night photography up on the overlook. But when we pulled in, only 2 vehicles were sitting under the dull glow of the streetlight. Our truck and an old red Ford Ranger with dull paint and a sagging bumper. The kind of truck that looked like it had been sitting there long enough for the dust to become part of the finish. One of my cousin's friends made a joke about the spot looking abandoned, but there was something about that nearly empty lot that felt more heavy than peaceful, like the air itself was waiting for something to happen. The cold hit as soon as we stepped out. It was the kind of air that settles into your sleeves and stiffens your fingertips even if you're wearing gloves. The forest around us had that late October smell. Wet leaves, cold dirt, and the faint coppery scent of decaying foliage. Our headlamps cut narrow tunnels through the darkness, catching flakes of dry bark lifting in the wind. Once we were on the trail, the only real sound was the constant shuffle of our boots through the leaves and the faint static whisper of wind moving across branches. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath. We climbed slowly, partly because the trail switched back and forth in tight turns, and partly because none of us wanted to be the one who slipped in the dark. The ground was slick from rain the night before, and the leaves acted like they'd been polished. Every few minutes one of us would skid a little, catch ourselves, and keep going with that quick jolt of embarrassment followed by relief. The headlamps kept swinging around too much, lighting up the trees instead of the ground, and I kept thinking how stupid it would be to break an ankle on a trail we had no real reason to be hiking in the first place. About halfway up, the ridge opened just slightly enough for us to catch our breath. My cousin stopped, leaned forward, and rested his hands on his knees. The others spread out along the narrow patch of flat ground. I pulled off my gloves, wiped the sweat off my face, and turned off my headlamp for a moment just to let my eyes adjust to the shape of the night. The darkness settled in instantly, layered and deep, with only the faint glow from someone's lamp still bouncing off the trunks behind us. I flicked my own light back on and scanned up the trail. That's when I saw it. Another beam of light farther ahead, maybe 100 feet or so, but angled in a way that didn't make sense. It wasn't moving like someone walking. It glided side to side between the trees, slow and deliberate, without any rise or fall. A person climbing a steep trail always has that natural bobbing rhythm, but this light drifted like someone holding a lantern on a rope and pulling it gently across open air. At first I assumed it was another group finishing the hike before us, maybe someone taking their time coming down from the overlook. I waited for the crunch of steps or even the unmistakable sound of fabrics rubbing, but the forest stayed silent except for our own breathing. The light kept sliding from one trunk to another, steady and unbroken. I felt a prickle of unease, not quite fear yet, just the awareness that something wasn't right. I watched the light move in slow strokes, almost like it was searching the trees, and then suddenly it went out. Not dimmed or flickered, just snapped off, disappearing so completely it was like it had never been there. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. The woods, which had carried faint noises earlier, suddenly felt sealed shut. No insects, no rustling, no wind brushing against the leaves. It was the kind of quiet where you feel your own heartbeat, like it's coming from outside your body. We stood there longer than we probably should have, letting the air settle again, and eventually we decided to head back down instead of pushing to the rock ledge. The thought of navigating the narrow outcrop in the dark felt stupid, and none of us wanted to deal with it. My legs felt stiff as we turned around, and the first few steps downward made the whole trail tilt differently in my head. Going down is always harder than going up, and the slick leaves felt twice as unstable on the decline. After a few minutes of steady descent, I realized the uneasy feeling wasn't fading. Every time I turned my head, my lamp cast long, thin shadows stretching down the path ahead of us. They jittered with every step, creating shapes that vanished as quickly as they formed. I stayed near the middle of the group without even thinking about it, not wanting too much distance between myself and anyone else. Then I saw the light again. This time it was below us, down on another switchback that ran parallel to our trail but several yards down the slope. It glowed faintly at first, then brightened with a steady intensity, moving at the same slow, sweeping pace from one side of the trail to the other. The angle of it was wrong again, too low to be someone just walking normally, too steady to be held by someone navigating the same terrible footing we were dealing with. It kept perfect speed with us, staying on the lower path as though it was tracking the pace of our descent. What unnerved me most wasn't the light itself, but the absence of any sound from it. If someone had been walking that trail in the same direction as us, especially at that proximity, the noise would have carried up the slope. Dry leaves, loose stones, branches snapping underfoot. Nothing like that floated up to us. The light moved without so much as a whisper, a clean curve of illumination gliding along the switchback like it was floating on rails. My chest tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years, a slow, cold pressure that built at the back of my ribs. I tried to keep my steps even, careful not to speed up and risk slipping, but every instinct wanted me off that mountain as quickly as possible. The others kept walking, staying closer together than before, and even though no one said anything, the atmosphere had shifted. It wasn't fun anymore. It wasn't even adventurous. It was the kind of mood where everyone is too alert, too aware of every sound, too focused on getting back to solid ground. The light finally disappeared when the trail curved sharply toward the lower section of the mountain. One moment it was there, sweeping methodically along the switchback, and the next the trees cut off the sight line. I kept waiting to catch another glimpse of it through the gaps, but nothing appeared. The forest gradually started producing sound again. Distant leaves rustling, the faint trickle of water somewhere down the slope, the low hum of wind moving across the ridge. I didn't realize how tense my shoulders had been until they started to loosen. By the time the trail flattened out near the bottom, my legs were trembling from the constant downhill pressure. The gravel of the parking lot felt almost soft under my boots after the harsh terrain above. The truck came into view between the trees, dark and still under the streetlight, and for a moment the sight of it felt like the first normal thing I'd seen in over an hour. The red Ford Ranger was still parked beside it, looking exactly as it had when we arrived, except that something about it felt different now. Maybe it was the way the shadows clung to its wheel wells, or how the dull paint absorbed the light instead of bouncing it back. I couldn't explain it. It just drew my attention in a way it hadn't before. I walked past it, intending only to get to the truck, but a strange pressure settled in my chest, a quiet but persistent urge to check the hood. It made no sense, but it felt almost like a push in the back of my thoughts, so I reached out and laid my hand on the metal. It was cold. Not just cool from the night air, but cold like it hadn't been driven in hours. No lingering warmth, no faint engine heat, nothing. The kind of cold you only feel when a vehicle has been sitting untouched for a long time. Something about that made my stomach tighten. I leaned closer to the window without really knowing why. The interior was dim, lit faintly by the streetlight reflecting off the glass. Hanging from the rearview mirror was a laminated volunteer badge, the kind used for search and rescue teams. The plastic was slightly yellowed, and a small photo sat above a name I didn't recognize. What caught my eye wasn't the picture, though. It was the expiration date printed in small numbers on the corner. 2014. 6 years before the night we were standing there. The realization settled in slowly, like cold water seeping through fabric. Whoever belonged to that badge hadn't updated it since long before Halloween 2020. If the truck really belonged to a SAR volunteer, it either hadn't moved in years or someone else had brought it here, and neither possibility felt good. I looked back toward the trailhead, up into the darkness where the winding path disappeared between the trees. The forest was black and silent again, hiding anything that might have been on the trail with us. The image of that drifting light replayed in my mind, its unnatural steadiness, its silent movement, its strange pacing. Everything suddenly felt far too connected to be random. We climbed into the truck without saying anything to each other. The air inside was warm from earlier sunlight, but it didn't feel comforting. As we pulled out of the parking lot, the headlights washed over the Ranger one last time. The badge swung gently from the mirror, twisting slowly on its string, catching the light for a brief moment before fading back into the interior darkness. I didn't look back again. I grew up just outside Johnson City, close enough to Buffalo Mountain that the ridge filled half the sky from our backyard. By high school, the mountain had become the place where everyone went when they wanted to feel older than they were. The trails were familiar, the overlooks felt private, and the dark up there had a way of making ordinary things seem dramatic. It was the kind of spot where a group of teenagers could convince themselves they understood nature simply because they were willing to sit in it after sunset. I had been up there dozens of times before the night in May 2013, and nothing about it had ever struck me as especially threatening. It was just our hangout, with its rock ledges and gravel paths and the smell of wet leaves settling in the soil. That night we started out around 10, 4 of us, parking farther down the road than usual, because someone had said the Ranger had been driving through earlier. We didn't want to risk headlights on the lot, so we cut across a patch of grass and picked up the white rock trail where the tree line opened. The trail was easy enough to follow even in darkness. The dirt was packed from heavy use, and the routes that crossed it happened in predictable places. Still, we felt better having our phones out, not as real lights, but as small patches of glow to anchor ourselves. The forest seemed thicker than usual, though, as if the leaves held every bit of humidity from the day and pushed it back at us. There was a damp smell rising from the ground that reminded me of basements, a mix of soil and lingering rain from earlier in the week. The climb wasn't long, maybe 20 minutes, but it felt slower without real lighting. We moved by habit more than sight, stepping over the same water bars and leaning into the same switchbacks we had known since freshman year. When we reached the small overlook we always used, the one with just enough space for a circle of friends and a couple backpacks, the mountain air felt cooler. The drop-off wasn't dramatic, not a cliff, just a sharp downward slope covered in stunted trees and rock debris. During the day you could see across the valley, but at night it was all outlines and shadows. We settled in a loose circle with our backs to the trees, letting the faint city glow drift up from the distance while we passed around the bottle that somebody had smuggled inside a hoodie. Nothing unusual happened for the first hour. The woods stayed still except for wind slipping across leaves and the occasional scrape of a branch shifting under its own weight. I remember dragging my fingertips through the thin layer of grit on the rock beside me, or watching small insects bounce around in the dim light of someone's phone screen. The alcohol worked its slow warmth through us, and the night felt more like a tradition than an adventure. It was comfortable, in the messy way teenage nights usually are. Cold stone under us, backpacks leaning against our legs, the faint buzz of my phone reminding me that my mom would eventually ask where I was. A little before midnight, something shifted in the mood of the group, though it didn't come all at once. It began with a sudden stillness from Lisa, who had been leaning forward, using her hands to describe something from earlier in the week. Her posture changed before any of us realized she had stopped talking. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to separate one sound from the others. I didn't hear anything at first, not beyond the breeze moving along the ridge or some distant car echoing through the valley. Then faintly there was a pattern. 3 short whistles, spaced evenly, followed by a pause. Not sharp, not loud, just enough to slip into the background and then tug itself free again. The first few times I barely caught it. It blended with the wind and seemed like something natural, maybe air squeezing through branches or a bird calling in a strange rhythm. But the more I paid attention, the more it seemed intentional. The spacing was too neat. It didn't drift or change pitch the way birds usually did at night. We tried not to overreact, though the silence between us made it clear we all heard the same thing. The sound came from somewhere below, farther down the slope, but not so far that it felt safely distant. The whistle repeated with the same timing, the same 3-note pattern, and each time it returned it carried a little more precision, as if whoever produced it was moving toward us. The oddest part was how clean it sounded. The forest wasn't making any of the usual noises that follow movement. No leaves shifting, no twigs snapping, no soft rattle of undergrowth being pushed aside. I remember raising my phone slightly and letting the screen's glow spill over the ground. It hit nothing but rocks and a few strands of grass. The dark in front of us felt heavier than before, not because anything supernatural was hiding there, but because the slope made it impossible to see more than a few yards at a time. The trees grew close together in that section, thin trunks leaning at all angles, stripping away the kind of visibility you usually get on mountain trails. The next time the whistle sounded, it seemed closer, maybe halfway up the slope. The pattern hadn't changed. Still 3 notes, still that brief pause. My chest tightened in a way I didn't want to acknowledge. It wasn't that I believed something mysterious was happening. It was the realization that someone else might actually be on that slope without a light, moving in a slow and steady line toward the overlook. On Buffalo Mountain, especially that late, there wasn't much reason for a person to be climbing alone without any gear. What made everything worse was the quick flash of white that appeared when someone tilted their phone downhill. The beam didn't reach far, but it skimmed across something pale moving between the trunks. At first I assumed it had to be a shirt. Hikers sometimes tied jackets around their waists or carried small bags that caught light strangely. But the shape didn't match a person's outline. It hung in a long, straight line, drifting behind whatever was attached to it. It didn't sway like clothing on a body. It moved the way a loose strip of fabric might if someone dragged it lightly through narrow gaps between trees. The whistle came again, but this time it came from behind us, clear enough that I felt it inside my right ear. I spun around so fast that I knocked my knee against my backpack, fumbling with my phone as the screen lit up the rock surface. There was nothing there. No movement, no sign of anyone stepping away. Just our own gear and the smooth rise of the trail heading back toward the car. The sudden shift in direction didn't make sense. There was no way someone could have climbed past us quietly, not with the loose stones that lined the upper part of the trail. Adrenaline made the next few moments blur. We grabbed our things without any coordination, nobody speaking, everyone acting on the same unspoken decision. We moved back onto the trail, relying on muscle memory and panic more than anything else. The path that had felt simple on the way up now seemed cluttered with obstacles, and we stumbled more than once. I scraped my hand on a rock trying to catch myself after slipping, and at one point I think all of us fell in a chain reaction, the kind where the weight of one person pulls the rest off balance. We didn't stop until the trail flattened and the parking area came into view through the trees. The lot was empty, the air warmer down there, and the sounds of the mountain faded into something ordinary again. As we reached the car, my phone buzzed with a call from my mom. She sounded angry in a way that cut through everything else, asking why the lights were on in every room of the house when nobody was home. The explanation was simple enough. I had left the house in a hurry, thinking the only risk of being caught was not making it back before she checked on me. I hadn't turned anything off. I hadn't bothered to look around on my way out. The idea that the lights were on felt like an accusation, but it was my own mistake, not anything connected to the mountain. Later that night, after I finally got home, I tried to piece together what we had heard. The whistle made the most sense as someone using a simple pattern to navigate in the dark, maybe calling to a friend or signaling location. The white shape might have been a length of trail tape caught on a backpack, or even a strip of reflective fabric shifting in uneven terrain. The sudden change in direction of the sound could have been an echo pushing upward from a different part of the slope, bouncing in a way that our tired minds interpreted as movement behind us. Fear had taken ordinary elements, wind, distance, shadows, and tied them together into something far more deliberate than it probably was. The more I replayed it, the more everything fit into those explanations, and the fear loosened. That night didn't turn into some lifelong mystery. It didn't change the mountain or the way I saw the woods. It became one of those stories teenagers tell each other for a few years before it fades. But every time I drive past the trailhead now, I remember how that whistle sounded when I finally recognized the pattern, and how easy it is to let the dark convince you that something simple is much more than it is. I took the job in the spring of 2020, when work was thin and I needed something steady. The utility company wasn't big, but it paid on time, and the routes through western North Carolina kept me outside, moving, instead of staring at a screen all day. Most of the work was simple: drive out, read meters, log line issues, and move on. The only catch was that some locations sat well off the main roads, old homesteads or seasonal cabins tucked into the folds of the hills. I usually didn't mind. I grew up in rural places, and being alone didn't bother me. By the time November rolled around, I knew my routes well enough that I hardly looked at my GPS. But that afternoon outside Bryson City still stands out, clear as any memory I have. It was a little after 3 when dispatch sent me the job. 1 meter check, a single cabin near the edge of the Nantahala National Forest. The track on the map looked more like a driveway than a real road, a thin black line curling up a ridge and ending abruptly. I figured it would be a quick read, maybe a seasonal home someone hadn't used in months. The sun was already dropping behind the ridge lines, leaving the light thin and flat, but I didn't think much of it. November always carried that early darkness, and the cold air helped me stay focused. The road was worse than I expected. It started as cracked blacktop, wide enough for one vehicle, then narrowed until I was easing my truck along the edge, watching the drop-off on my right. Dry leaves covered the surface so thickly that I couldn't tell where the pavement ended and the earth began. I kept my speed low, letting the tires crawl, and tried not to worry about how steep the hillside felt under the wheels. There was no cell service, which was common, but the isolation settled deeper the farther I went. The branches arched over the road like a tunnel, and the forest pressed in from both sides. After about 10 minutes of climbing, the trees opened into a small clearing. The cabin sat at the far end of it, a squat rectangle of dark wood with a tin roof dulled from years of rain. A single gravel driveway led up to it, but weeds had grown in thick patches between the stones. Nobody had driven there in months. No car, no signs of recent use. One of the front windows had plywood nailed over it, and the boards were weathered and gray. The place had that look of being empty long enough for the forest to start reclaiming it. I parked and sat for a moment, listening. There were the usual forest sounds, wind dragging through the pines, the faint dry shuffle of leaves, but nothing human. The air felt colder there, like the sunlight didn't quite reach the clearing. Still, the cabin had an active meter, and my job was to check it. I walked up to the porch, the boards soft under my boots. I knocked on the door out of habit, announced myself the way we were trained to, even though I already knew nobody was going to answer. The silence afterward felt heavy. I tried the door gently. Locked. No surprise there. The meter was listed as being on the back wall. That meant walking around the side, and that was when I noticed the ground. The soil beside the cabin wasn't leaf-covered like the rest of the clearing. It was bare clay packed down hard. The first thing I saw was the overlapping circles of footprints, small ones, dozens of them, stamped into the dirt. They were all the same size, like from a child's shoe, and they looped around the cabin in wide arcs, crossing over each other in no real pattern. They didn't lead from or toward the driveway. They didn't trail into the trees. They just circled the building repeatedly, like whoever made them had walked until there was no clean ground left. At first I thought maybe animals had churned the soil, but the shapes were clear. Treads, heels, toes. Human. I crouched to look closer. The prints were sharp-edged, not softened by rain or wind. They looked recent. I straightened up slowly, trying to make sense of it. It didn't match anything I'd seen before, not even on the strangest properties. I continued around the house, telling myself it didn't matter. I just needed the reading. But the atmosphere had changed. The forest felt tighter, the cabin darker, and the fading daylight made everything look colder. I reached the back wall. The meter was there, newer than the rest of the house by decades. It looked like the kind we'd begun installing the year before, digital, clean, shiny under the thin film of dust. I bent down with my handheld scanner. The display on the meter pulsed like normal, showing usage numbers. Then it blinked, not in the usual cycling pattern, but abruptly, as if resetting. The numbers vanished for a second and were replaced by a single word: help. Then the numbers flashed back on. Then the word again. It didn't make sense. Meters don't display words like that. There's no programming for messages. If there's a fault, they show codes, letters and numbers, not language. I backed away instinctively, keeping my eyes on the screen. It flickered one more time, the word appearing almost steady, as though something was forcing it through. Before I could step farther back, 3 knocks came from inside the wall behind the meter. Slow, evenly spaced, heavy enough to vibrate the boards. I froze. My head had been inches from that spot just seconds earlier. I didn't move, didn't breathe. My mind went blank except for one clear thought. Someone was inside that wall. I waited, but nothing followed. No shuffling, no voices, no second set of knocks. The forest had gone completely still, as if the entire clearing was holding its breath with me. The logical part of my brain tried to catch up. Animals can't knock like that. Wind can't strike a wall in 3 even impacts. And no one seals themselves inside the back wall of a mountain cabin. But the prints around the cabin weren't logical either. I forced myself to leave the area behind the house and return toward the clearing, keeping my eyes on the ground and the windows. I didn't run, but every instinct screamed for me to get away. When I reached the front of the cabin again, I noticed something I had missed earlier. The plywood over the window wasn't covering damage. It was covering the glass from the inside. Someone had nailed it up while standing within the cabin, not outside it. I turned toward my truck and moved faster. The moment I shut the door, my hands started shaking, not violently, but enough that I had trouble putting the keys into the ignition. The cab smelled familiar, warm fabric, dust, engine oil. And for a second I just sat there, trying to let it wash the tension out of me. Then I started the engine and backed out carefully, checking the mirrors again and again, half expecting to see movement in the trees or at the cabin door. The road felt longer on the way down, the drop-off sharper. When I finally reached the main highway, the relief hit me all at once. I drove to a nearby turnout where my phone had a signal. I contacted dispatch and told them the meter appeared faulty and the property might have a safety issue. I didn't mention the knocks. I didn't mention the footprints. I only said the house looked abandoned and that someone else should handle the follow-up. 2 days later, a senior tech called me. He said the cabin had been flagged for vacancy for over a year. No usage on record, no confirmed residents, but the meter had been switched on as part of a broad system update the previous winter. When they sent someone out after my report, the cabin was empty. Completely. No furniture, no signs of anyone living there. The interior walls were intact, dry, normal. And the ground outside had been washed clean by an overnight rain. No footprints remained. He didn't ask why I sounded uneasy. He just said they disconnected the meter entirely and closed the job. For months afterward, I tried to come up with a rational explanation for everything. Maybe the display malfunctioned. Maybe the knocks were something shifting inside the wall. Maybe the footprints belonged to kids who once lived there, preserved in the clay for longer than I realized. I repeated those thoughts like a script whenever the memory surfaced. But the truth sits with me every time the air turns sharp and the November light slides thin across the hills. I know what I saw on that meter. I know how deliberate those knocks were. And I know, as clearly as I know anything, that someone had been in that cabin not long before I arrived. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who had walked endless circles around a house that should have been empty, waiting for something or someone that wasn't me. What unsettles me most isn't what happened that day. It's the thought that whoever it was might still be out there, moving from one forgotten cabin to another, leaving no trail that lasts long enough for anyone to follow. I got out of the foreman's truck that morning with the feeling that the whole day would be heavier than it needed to be. The air had that dense August weight, the kind that never seems to move, even when you're high enough in the hills that the wind should have room to breathe. It was just after sunrise, but the clearing off the dirt spur already felt used up, like a place that had been sitting awake all night. The logging scars were decades old, but the ground still looked scratched and uneven, and the tree line pressed in from all sides like it wanted to take the space back. Raoul and I checked our packs, counted the flagging tape rolls, and waited for the foreman's taillights to disappear down the spur before starting toward the slope. Survey work on old cut land is mostly repetition. You keep your eyes low, follow whatever faint markers survived the seasons, and trust that the previous crews weren't sloppy. We'd been told that this parcel had been surveyed in the early 90s, back when people still used thick orange tape that bleached out fast in sun. Even before the heat started pressing down, I could tell the day would be slow. Every piece of tape we found was shredded or almost white, and we had to walk with our heads practically in the brush to spot it. The ridgeline rolled upward in long, uneven stretches, and every 100 feet the forest rearranged itself to look like the place we had just passed through. By mid-morning I had sweat running down my back in cold sheets. The air under the canopy didn't move at all, and each breath tasted like warm bark. Raoul stayed 15 or 20 feet behind me, just close enough that I could hear the drag of his boots, but not close enough for easy company. The slope kept rising in soft humps, and each time I thought we were reaching the crest, it only shifted into another incline. It was the kind of terrain that slowly erases your sense of direction without you noticing. The only reliable thing was the next strip of tape, faded to near nothing. We stopped around noon for water, but even standing still didn't feel like rest. The forest was too quiet. No traffic noises made it this far, and the insects seemed to hum from a single thick note that spread evenly in all directions. When we started up again, I felt a faint tension at the base of my neck, like I'd left something important behind. The tape line was supposed to curve east around the ridge, then back south toward the clearing. Instead, it ran straight up a shallow draw, heading deeper into indistinguishable woods. The next marker was almost gray, hanging limp from a thin sapling. The bark beneath it had grown around the knot in a way that nearly swallowed the tape. I checked my map even though it didn't matter. With old surveys, the ground always told the truth, and the tape was supposed to carry that truth forward. But standing there, looking uphill into trees that all leaned the same way, I realized I couldn't tell if the marker was the end of the line or if the next one had simply vanished. I walked slowly, scanning every trunk, every branch, every place someone might have tied a strip 30 years earlier. Raoul stood by the last marker, not saying anything, just waiting. I kept moving, stepping over roots and through pockets of undergrowth that clung to my boots. After 50 yards, I still hadn't found anything. After 70, I started to wonder if we'd already passed it without realizing. The hill flattened briefly, forming a shelf of level ground the size of a small yard. At first it looked like the forest had simply opened up for no reason. Then I saw the stakes. They were driven into the ground in a perfect circle, each one shaved clean at the top, each one about the thickness of a broom handle. There were maybe 24 of them, evenly spaced, forming a ring about 30 feet across. The soil between them had that faint settled look, the kind you see in places where people have walked recently, but not enough to leave obvious tracks. The trees around the circle leaned away slightly, or maybe that was just the effect of the open space. I felt my shoulders tighten without knowing why. In the dead center of the circle was a stump. It wasn't old enough to be from the original logging. The cut looked too clean, the surface too flat, like someone had taken it down in the last few years. On top of it sat a mason jar filled with cloudy liquid the color of old dishwater. The lid was rusted but screwed tight. Pressed against the inside glass was something rectangular, pale around the edges. As I stepped closer, I realized it was a Polaroid. I could hear Raoul's boots reach the edge of the circle behind me, then stop. The insects had quieted. Even the heat felt different, like it was trying not to move. I approached the stump slowly, not sure why my breathing had gone shallow. The jar was clean except for the rust on the lid, and the Polaroid inside was perfectly centered, as if someone had placed it carefully upright before sealing the jar. The photograph showed the clearing where we'd been dropped off that morning. Same angle, same tree. The brush pile near the spur road was in the exact same shape. But what held my attention was the figures standing in the center of the clearing. They had their back to the camera. They were wearing a bright orange vest. The exact same vest issued by our company, the kind we all wore because it was cheap and easy to replace. The date scrawled on the bottom of the Polaroid in shaky pen read August 12, 15. The same date on my phone. The same morning we'd arrived. My first thought wasn't that anything impossible had happened. It was that someone had been watching us long before we reached this hill. Someone had walked out to the clearing early, taken that picture, sealed it in a jar, and placed it here knowing we'd eventually find it. There was nothing supernatural about it, but the intent behind it felt more deliberate than anything I was prepared to handle. I kept trying to think of harmless explanations, maybe a prank from a previous crew, maybe something left behind months ago, but the conditions didn't fit. The clearing in the photograph looked exactly as it had that morning. Not a month ago, not last year, today. The stillness around the circle deepened, as if the forest itself was waiting to see what I'd do. I didn't touch the jar. I didn't pick it up, didn't move it, didn't twist the lid. Instead, I stepped back until I felt the line of stakes behind my calves. I realized then that the circle had no breaks in it. Whoever set those stakes had intended them to form a boundary. Maybe symbolic, maybe just personal, but intentional nonetheless. It took a full minute before I could steady my breathing. I kept replaying the morning in my head, the sound of the truck pulling away, the empty clearing, the still air, and every time I reached the moment we turned uphill, I felt that same prickling sense at the back of my neck. Not fear of something supernatural, but fear of something real, physical, and human. Someone had been close enough to take a picture of us without being noticed. Someone had walked through these woods long enough to know where an old survey line would lead, long enough to wait for us to reach the end of it. When I finally stepped out of the circle, the air seemed to loosen around me. Raoul followed as I walked back the way we'd come, checking over my shoulder more times than was useful. We didn't speak. Words would have made me feel trapped. All I wanted was to reach the spur road, to put open distance between myself and the quiet space where someone had decided we should find that jar. The foreman didn't ask many questions when we returned earlier than planned. I simply told him the markers were too faded to follow, and that we'd missed the line. I didn't mention the stakes, or the jar, or the Polaroid. It felt too personal, like sharing it would make it more real. That evening, after I got back to the motel in Pikeville, I kept thinking about the clearing in the photograph. I tried to convince myself that the picture could have been taken earlier that morning by someone passing through, someone who meant no harm, someone who had their own reason for marking a circle in the woods. That explanation sat well enough to keep me steady, but it didn't erase the feeling of being observed. In the end, what stayed with me wasn't the jar or the image or even the circle. It was the timing. Whoever took that photo had known exactly when we would be there. They had walked ahead of us, placed the jar, and left without leaving any sign of their path. It didn't take anything supernatural to unsettle me. It only took the awareness that someone had moved through those woods with more knowledge of us than we had of them, watching long enough to leave something behind, precise and deliberate, waiting in a place we were guaranteed to reach. For the rest of that job, I never stepped into the woods without the feeling that someone else already knew the route I would take. It was 6:40 p.m. on October 9th, 2022, and I was halfway up an old fire road outside Harlan, Kentucky, trying to make it back to my truck before the fog finished swallowing the ridge. I had parked just before the trailhead, mostly because the ruts were deeper than I expected and partly because the place looked abandoned, the kind of road locals still used but no one bothered maintaining. I had planned a simple out-and-back walk, just enough to stretch my legs before the drive home, and I had relied on an old USGS topo I found online since the trail wasn't on Google Maps. The ridge looked straightforward on paper, a gradual climb following an abandoned logging cut, but the air had turned colder on the way up, and the fog had started rising out of the hollows long before sunset. I was about a mile from the truck, when I saw the sign. It was nailed crookedly to a poplar, the board splintered and gray, the letters brushed on in uneven strokes of red paint. It read, "No more dogs," the words dripping slightly as if the painter had pressed too hard or hadn't waited for the paint to thicken. I stopped long enough to read it twice and tried to make sense of it. It looked old, but not too old. Maybe a year or two. I guessed it was some hunter's warning, maybe a private property dispute. People in those hills didn't always have the friendliest ways of telling you to stay out. I kept walking, telling myself I was close enough to the truck that turning back now felt pointless. 10 minutes later, I started seeing the collars. The first one hung from a low laurel branch on the right side of the road, the leather dark and cracked, the buckle bent out of shape like it had been twisted with pliers. There was no tag, no identifying mark, nothing but a strip of torn leather that looked like it had seen years of rain. I slowed down, noticed the second one a little farther on. A thicker collar, maybe from a larger dog, the kind with reinforced buckles. It also had no tag, and the metal piece had a strange bend, like it had been pulled backward instead of pried open. The third collar hung at my eye level on a thin sycamore branch, and still had tufts of tan fur stuck to the inside. The fur was old, matted, and stuck together in stiff clumps. I felt something tighten in the back of my throat, not fear exactly, just the awareness that something wasn't right and that no one had mentioned any missing dogs in the area. The fog had crept up fast while I was staring at the collars. It moved across the ground like something poured into the hollow and was now spilling over the rim. I heard a single sharp yelp from somewhere down the slope to my left. It wasn't the long, desperate sound a dog makes when hurt. It was short and sudden, cut off halfway like something had grabbed the breath out of it. I froze, trying to place the direction. The hollows in that area carried sound strangely. A branch cracking uphill could echo downhill, and vice versa. The yelp came again in my memory as I waited for a second real one that didn't come. The fire road narrowed where I stood, the gravel thinning into patches of exposed soil and dead leaves. I stepped off the side to get a better look down the ridge, pushing aside a few young poplars. The ground beneath the leaves felt wrong under my boot, softer than it should have been, like old mulch or ground recently disturbed. I shifted my weight, and the top layer gave way. My right boot sank a little deeper, and the smell hit me before I saw anything. It was the thick, sweet stench of rot mixed with something earthy and metallic. I pulled my foot back quickly, scraped it against a rock to remove the clinging mess, and brushed the leaves away with a stick. Beneath them was a shallow pit maybe 3 feet wide, sunk just deep enough to hold what was left inside. There were bones, small ones, some still wrapped in clumps of fur, some picked clean. Rib cages collapsed inward, spines curled in unnatural bends, skulls barely bigger than my fist. The fur was flattened into the dirt, half decayed, half smothered by moisture. The pit wasn't fresh, but it wasn't old either. The soil around the edges looked recently overturned, the color lighter where it had been exposed to the air. It didn't look like the work of scavengers. The remains were too concentrated, too organized in the shallow basin. Someone had put them there. I backed away from the pit and wiped my palms on my pants, even though I hadn't touched anything. My heartbeat had slowed into a heavy, steady thud that I could feel in my jaw. The woods had gone quiet in a way that made the silence feel heavy. Even the fog didn't make noise. It just hovered and shifted between the trees, thick enough that the far side of the road looked like a gray wall. Then something moved deeper in the brush. It wasn't loud, just a shifting of weight, the soft drag of something against undergrowth, the kind of movement that didn't match the size of any squirrel or raccoon. I saw nothing at first, but then the fog thinned in one spot between two trees, and I made out the outline of a shape. It was tall, taller than me, and narrow, as if someone was standing with their shoulders pulled inward. I couldn't see details, just the silhouette and the slight tilt of the upper portion, like a head angled to listen. The breathing that came next had a thick, wet rattle to it, not quite human, not quite something I could place. It reminded me of the sound someone makes trying to breathe through a chest cold, but deeper and uneven. I didn't wait to see more. Instinct took over, and I ran back toward the road. The gravel shifted under my boots, and I nearly slipped twice, but I kept moving, not caring how loud I was. As I ran, more collars appeared hanging from branches I hadn't noticed on the way up. They swung lightly in the rising wind, reacting in a slow, eerie rhythm, almost like someone had hung them at the right height to be seen only when heading downhill. The fog funneled down the road, and I ran through it until my shirt stuck to my back with sweat and the air burned cold in my lungs. By the time I saw the faint outline of my truck through the haze, the woods behind me had gone silent again. The breathing had stopped somewhere along the ridge. I didn't look back. I unlocked the truck with shaking fingers, climbed in, and slammed the door harder than necessary. I sat there for a moment, the engine idling, my hands gripping the wheel while I waited for my breathing to steady. Before I drove off, I looked once at the trail entrance in my rearview mirror. The fog had pooled across the opening, flattening itself into the underbrush as if the hollow had pulled it back in. I didn't see the shape again. I didn't hear the breathing. But the collars hung there, spaced almost evenly along the first stretch of the road, each one turning slightly with the wind. I reported what I saw the next morning to the county sheriff's office. The deputy on the phone didn't sound surprised. He only asked for the nearest landmark and the approximate location of the pit. A week later, I called back to ask if they found anything. The deputy said they had removed several animal remains, but didn't find signs of a living threat. He said it was likely the work of someone trapping illegally or dumping unwanted dogs. He didn't say why the collars were hung at eye level, or what the sign meant, or why whoever did it chose a hidden fire road that wasn't on most maps. I haven't gone back to that ridge since. I avoid that stretch of road entirely when I pass through Harlan now. Every time I think of the collars swaying in the wind, I remember the shape in the fog and the rattling breath that didn't fit with any explanation I was given. The memory of that moment returns most clearly at dusk, when the treeline darkens and the last light sinks behind the hills. I can still feel the soft soil give under my boot and smell the rot rising from that pit. I remind myself that everything I saw can be explained by human hands and human cruelty. Nothing supernatural, nothing impossible. But the way the collars were arranged and the timing of that single cut-off yelp stay with me, as if someone had been waiting for another dog to wander too close to that hollow. I made it out because I wasn't a dog. That's what I tell myself. But sometimes, when fog gathers in low places, I think about how quiet the woods became just before the breathing stopped, and how someone out there knew those dogs well enough to hang their collars where the wind would find them.